Hey, this is Matthew with Build It Make It. My little sister and her husband recently bought their first house, so I made them a custom dining room table out of walnut and mahogany. Watch along to see how I built it and how it turned out. Earlier this year, my sister came down to visit me and my family in New Mexico, and so we were able to go together to the lumber store so she could choose out the wood that she wanted for the tabletop. We found two 12-foot long pieces of walnut that were 8/4 thick and 10.5 inches wide. This means out of just those two pieces of wood, I can cut them in half and glue up the entire tabletop, which is pretty fabulous. Since these boards are so wide, they actually don't fit on my jointer, so I'm gonna use a router sled that I recently built and flatten out one of the faces on each of these 4 boards. Now that one of the sides on each of these boards is flattened, I'm going to take them and run them through the planer. I've been able to mill up both the faces and I'm really happy with that. This wood is looking fantastic and it went really well. Now that they're looking good though, I'll be able to trim off the edges and we can get gluing this tabletop together. I brought over a couple of clamps and set them here on the torsion box and then laid out all my pieces of wood in the order and direction that I want for the actual glue up. I also took the time a little bit earlier to sand down a couple of these boards with just 320 grit sandpaper. That won't affect any dimensions, but will give me a little bit of sawdust so that when I actually get to the glue up, I can use that sawdust to clean up any squeeze out, which will help clean up. And also if there's any tiny little gaps, that'll hide it with the wood that's actually the color of these planks. I got the table up here. It's looking pretty good. I flipped it onto the back. I know this is overkill and I really don't need to, but I think I'm gonna get out the router sled and flatten the bottom, flip it over and flatten the top. There's a little bit of gaps and honestly the router sled goes really fast. I like it better than sanding, so I'm gonna do that and have a really flat table. Flattening out the bottom and the top of the table with the router sled worked really well. Before I flipped it over and flattened the top, I put tape on all of the knots that I could see on the bottom because the next thing that I want to do is to pour some epoxy into all of the knot holes. I'm going to use some quick setting epoxy by West Systems and that'll harden up overnight and then I'll be able to continue work on this table in the morning. The epoxy pour went really well. I poured last night, let it harden up. I sanded down the whole thing with 60 grit to get rid of the mill marks and also sand down those epoxy places. I had some voids left in the epoxy. I actually had one of the knot holes boil on me, probably because it was too big and I used fast setting epoxy, so that's my bad, I'm impatient. I poured another set of epoxy this morning, let it dry for a couple of hours, and then sanded it down. And it was looking pretty good. I still had a bunch of little holes, pinholes, and so I'm just filling those up with super glue. I just added a little bit to a syringe, and then I've just been dabbing it on those little places as it seeps in, put a little dot on there. It works pretty well, and with the black epoxy, you can't really tell that the super glue is there. I've got the knot holes filled in this table, so now it's time to cut it down to the length that I need it. In my case, I'm gonna cut this down to 5.5 feet long, mostly because I have to take this to my sister, and she lives a long ways away, and I need to fit it into the back of my truck, so that gives me 1/2 inch of space to spare, so I can do a 5.5 foot tabletop. If you have a longer truck, you can do a bigger table. I've got the bottom of the table filled with some epoxy, some of those big areas, and then I just sanded the whole thing down just roughly so that my router is gonna have a nice base to sit on. That's going to be good because I've got a lot of wood to take away. I'm gonna use a 60-degree router bit, so that's a 2-to-1 ratio, so it's gonna come in really far on the bottom of the table and then half that much up the side. And I think that's gonna give it a really classy look, kind of lighten up the feel of the table while still being able to have a really thick tabletop. After the routing and the sanding, it's time to fill up the last of the gaps. This has some cracks on one edge, and so I need to fix that. I could try to do it with epoxy, but it's a little bit tricky on the edges, especially with the chamfer in there. So instead, I'm gonna use a trick from Luthier's, which is to use super glue and baking soda. The baking soda and super glue react and create a super hard bond that often is used for the repair of guitar nuts, so that'll be plenty strong for us. The only problem is I don't want it white. Now if I try to dye the super glue, it reacts with the dye and then just boils away and hardens. So instead I add the dye to the baking soda, and then I can pack that into any gaps that I have and then just pour on real thin super glue that'll harden up super hard and give me a nice black fill that looks very similar to the epoxy. And it's super fast to finish. So hardens up, I can sand it down a few minutes later and then move on with the project. Now it's time to put the finish on this tabletop. I sanded down the entire thing to 220 grit, both the front and the back. I like doing it to 220 grit because I think that feels really good, and I think it works really well with Rubio Monocoat, which is the finish that I'm gonna be using. I'll mix the part A with the part B, which is the accelerator, mix that up, and then I'll use a hand squeegee to push that finish all over the top of the tabletop. Once that's on there, I'll use a white Brillo pad. Once that's pushed into all of the little crevices, I'll come back with some blue shop towels, wipe it down as best as I can, get off as much as I can, and then come back and buff off the rest of the finish. Now the tabletop is looking really good. We need to move on and start working on the base. I looked through the wood that I have, and I have these 4 boards of African mahogany, and this should be enough to give me the 4 legs and aprons for the table. I was looking at what it would look like with a mahogany bottom and the walnut top, and I wasn't a huge fan of that. And again, my sister said that she wanted it painted, so I added into Fusion. I put in the actual color of the charcoal chalk paint, and I think it does look better. Honestly, the chalk paint does wear, and you'll see through to the wood over time. And I think that it's gonna look really good to have that charcoal base, and then as it wears, you'll be getting this deep, rich color from the African mahogany coming through. So I think it's gonna look pretty sweet. I had the leg blanks all ready up. I squared them up and cut them to length, in this case 28 inches long. And now it's time to put a taper on 2 of the edges. I'm gonna be putting the taper using the planer, and so I need a sled that's gonna hold the legs in place while I run it through and cut the taper on 2 of the sides. My planer can fit 12.5 inches, so I cut this board to 12.5 inches, cut off a couple of pieces, and then I drill through those, attach it at the front, and then 28 inches back. I have a 1/2 inch piece of plywood that I'll be using to set the height, and then I will just mark on these pieces of wood 3.5 inches down, and I will plane until I hit that line, which will give me square the first like 3.5 inches of the leg, and then taper down about 1/2 inch down towards the bottom, and I will do that on 2 sides to give me nice tapered legs. All right, now we need to square these up. I've got the 4 aprons all milled up, and now it's time to make these a little bit fancier. So here's one of the short pieces. I want to put a gentle curve across this on the bottom. I have just a little bit of offcut from the walnut from the table, and I'll use that to mark on the piece how I want it, and then I will just cut that out on one of them, sand it up, mark it on the next one, and do the same. I've got all of the curves cut and sanded on all of the aprons. They're a little bit thinner than I was expecting, but we'll see how it looks when it's done. I may have been over aggressive on my gentle curve, and it's not so gentle anymore. But I need to attach those to the table legs. For me, I'm gonna use the domino because I have one. I need to cut this. I'm gonna put in 2 8mm dominoes into each side of the apron. I've got the legs and the aprons all sanded up, and it turned out really nice. I'm really happy with the way that everything is looking. I only sanded to 120 grit because I'm actually going to apply chalk paint on here. I've got some Rust-Oleum charcoal colored chalk paint. I'm gonna use just a traditional chalk paint brush. I'll put on 1 coat, sand it down so it's nice and smooth, and then I'll apply a second coat. I've got the base glued up. It went really well, no issues there. And now it's time to do the hardware for attaching the tabletop. I'm gonna use these figure-8 fasteners. I really like them. I've never had issues with them. They're nice because they allow wood movement and they're really easy and quick to install. Wood is going to expand and contract most perpendicular to the grain. So I'm going to attach these on the short side of the table, and that will allow that expansion and contraction to happen and things shouldn't bust apart. I am gonna put one in the middle of my apron on the long side. I will attach them on the sides slightly at an angle. If there's a good reason not to do that, let me know down in the comments, although I will have already done it. I've got the tabletop flipped upside down like this, and I've got the base put on top of that. And now I'm going to just use a self-centering drill bit and drill out the holes so I don't split the top. And then I can screw it in and attach it. Also, I have this upside down. I'm gonna put some pads on the legs, and that will be the table fully assembled. Let's get this table delivered.
Oh my gosh, that is so pretty. Thank you.
We've got the table here set up in my sister's house and everything is looking really good. They seem very happy with the table, so I'm glad. While we were here, of course, this is a vacation with my family, so we all undertook a project together and we refinished the chairs that she already had. We used the same chalk paint and painting technique that I did on the table base, so those matched nicely. Also, my wife, mom, and sister, they reupholstered the chairs so that now it matches the decor of her kitchen and living room, and everything is all tied together. So I think altogether it's a really nice looking set that looks very intentional. If you've enjoyed this content, a like would be great. That really helps out the channel. And also, if you want to see other content like this, hit that subscribe button. If you like the way that this table turned out, I have some plans for sale. There's a link down in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and take care. We dropped off the table and don't have that anymore, but what we did pick up is this little girl. Her name's Dolly. She's 8 weeks old.